Welcome again to our guests of the Old Guard. Our guest speaker today is Sarah Bracy White, who is a teacher, writer, arts consultant, and curator. She has written a number of works, latest of which is Primary Lessons, a memoir which speaks of her experience as a young girl being moved from Philadelphia to what part of South Carolina? Sumter, South Carolina, which is where the Civil War started, right? There you go. For the past 23 years, she has been the town of Greenburgh's Executive Director of Cultural Affairs, where she is the administrative manager and fundraiser for a full range of cultural and artistic programs serving 83,000 people. She's been a college and legislative librarian, speechwriter, and special representative to the mayor, for the mayor of Baltimore City. She's a highly sought-after speaker, and I'm glad that Lloyd was able to catch her. She has appeared on Good Day New York, WFAS, WVOX, and Channel 12. And since the release of her memoir, she is frequently asked to speak at book clubs, churches, synagogues, libraries, and schools. She's chaired many local charitable events, most notably the Greenburgh Library annual Friends fundraiser, Books and Cooks. I present to you our guest speaker, Sarah Bracy White.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carver. It's a pleasure to be back among the old guard. Now, you may think that's strange, but about 25 years ago, when my husband and I were newlyweds and I could still dance the Lindy and the foxtrot, you held a New Year's party, right? And we went, and it was the first I'd ever heard of the old guard. So when Lloyd asked me to come today, I felt like I was not coming into strange land. However, I must tell you, I have never spoken to so many men at once. I was really happy to see a few brave women come in so that I don't quite feel like I've got you all at my beck and call. Thank you for that introduction, which gave you some of the current thing about who I am. But what I always say is who we see in a person is never all that they are. As I was talking to people, Buddy, where are you, Buddy? Buddy told me he was from Richmond. He'd been in the Maryland area. He'd been south of the Mason-Dixon line. There you are. And it makes me aware that so many people who live in the suburbs of New York City up here in Westchester have ties to the South. I never know what to talk about when I talk to a new audience about my life. I was born in 1946, so I'm 71 years old, and I've lived long enough to see lots of things change. What I'd like to talk to you today is that amidst adversity, the individual has a power over their lives. You decide what you're going to do with the deck of cards that you're given. At 5, I decided that I was going to be in charge of my life. Now, for a 5-year-old to have that kind of attitude with her mother is a little problematic. I had spent the first 5 years of my life in Philadelphia with my mother's older sister, who was actually old enough to be my grandmother. The reason I was sent from Sumter, South Carolina into Philadelphia was because my father got involved with the NAACP, and because he would not give the names to the white school superintendent of his fellow teachers who had attended the meeting, he was blacklisted from his job and promised that he would never again teach anywhere. That promise was maintained throughout his life. My father died as a migrant worker for the Donald Duck Orange Juice Company in Florida in 1963. He was not lynched, but he was emotionally tied in ways that destroyed our family. My mother, who was a school teacher, was permitted to continue to teach. So I was 7 months old. All of her family had migrated north, and there was no one to take care of the 7-month-old so she could go back to teaching. But her older sister, Susie, who had no children of her own, wanted me to take care of. So my mother sent me to Philadelphia with the caveat that it was only until I was old enough to go to school. What I'd like to read to you today is not necessarily from primary lessons. However, it is a distillation of the person who made me who I am. A memoir is how we remember something or someone. It is not simply a biographical study of the person. Antonia Augusta Bracey was the name on her 1902 birth certificate. She started calling herself Susie when everybody in Sumter, South Carolina seemed to mispronounce her name. Susie was the oldest of 8 children. Her daddy, a blacksmith, could read and write. Her mother couldn't. So Susie felt lucky to finish the 8th grade before she went to work alongside her mother, washing and ironing other people's clothes. But Susie had bigger plans for her life than that promised to dark-skinned girls living in the Jim Crow South. Before she was 20, like thousands before her, she migrated north to the city of brotherly love and got herself another job, washing and ironing other people's clothes. But this time, she was paid a fair wage and learned to use the equipment that made washing and ironing easier. Then she met Chappie White, a tall, very light-skinned man with wavy jet black curls. Susie figured that together they'd make beautiful brown-skinned babies with good hair. They got married, saved their money, and bought a 4-bedroom row house on Smedley Street in North Philadelphia. Susie started her own laundry business in the basement of that row house. But she only washed sheets, pillowcases, curtains, tablecloths, and napkins. I never want to touch another stranger's dirty underclothes in my life, she said. She worked hard and soon had a thriving business. Susie's house was the first stop for all her brothers and sisters when they too fled their Jim Crow hometown. After her siblings found work and saved enough money to buy their own row houses, Susie rented her spare bedrooms to other migrants who easily found work in Philadelphia, but couldn't always find a place to live if they didn't have family already living there. Susie's baby sister Roberta often came to Philadelphia when she was a teenager, but she didn't like city living and always returned to Sumter in time to start school in the fall. Susie regularly sent Roberta money and encouraged her education. The children Susie envisioned never came to be. So she convinced Chappie to let her adopt a baby, a girl who she named Loretta. For 3 years, Susie doted on that baby. Then just before Loretta turned 4, her appendix burst. Susie sat by her hospital bed for a week, praying that the fever would break and that her baby would get better. When Loretta died, Susie went back to washing and ironing other people's clothes. Time passed. Roberta went to college for 2 years, married, and then began to spit babies out like watermelon seeds. In between babies, she worked as a teacher at a country school. Susie watched from afar and tried not to be jealous of the sister she loved like a daughter. When Roberta had her fourth daughter, Susie convinced her to name the child Sarah, after their dead mother. When Roberta's husband got involved with the NAACP and was blacklisted from teaching, they lost everything. "I need to go back to my teaching job," she told Susie in a letter, "but there's nobody to take care of Sarah. I'll keep her for you until she's old enough to go to school like the rest of your girls," Susie wrote back. Roberta brought 7-month-old Sarah to Philadelphia. "She can only stay until she's old enough for school," Roberta said, before taking the train back to Sumter. Susie was almost old enough to be Sarah's grandmother, and like every grandmother does, she spoiled her. She relished Sarah's lively nature, talkativeness, and interest in everything and everyone on Smedley Street. She also liked that Sarah enjoyed listening to her stories about her beloved first little girl, Loretta. "I'll never leave you," Sarah would say when tears filled Susie's eyes. But Susie knew better. When Sarah got older, every Thursday they'd ride the trolley downtown to shop for dresses at John Wanamaker's and have lunch at Horn and Hardart. Roberta came to visit them every summer. Sarah smiled, greeted her mother politely, then clung to Susie's skirts. The summer after Sarah turned 5, Roberta announced that she was coming to take her daughter home. "My family's been divided long enough," she said. "Sarah doesn't know me or her sisters." At the North Philadelphia train station, when Sarah cried in Susie's arms and said, "I don't want to go," Susie held back her own tears. "Sometimes we have to do things we don't like," she said, then turned and waved goodbye. Broken-hearted once again, Susie returned to her washing and ironing. After a while, she filled her empty bedrooms with foster children and lavished the love she had left on them. So this is the story of the woman who made me the person that I am. So I'm this 5-year-old child who comes into the Jim Crow South and can't understand any of the things that are happening there. Now, you know that children are to be heard and not seen, right? At least that's how it used to be. I was not one of those children. I had something to say about everything. I was 9 when Emmett Till was killed. So imagine my mother trying to deal with a mouthy 9-year-old who she feared could cause their family even further problems. Mind you, her husband has lost his job. He has traveled different places to work. In my family, the children are 5 years apart. Every time my father came back home, my mother had another baby. So she's struggling with the idea that she's trying to make me a proper colored woman in the South. And I am not having any of this. I was fortunate to discover schools. Do any of you know the name Julius Rosenwald? Okay. Julius Rosenwald made a lot of money as a partner in Sears and Roebuck. One of the things that he did was he helped to build 5,000 schools in the Jim Crow South in the early 1900s, between 1900 and 1920. I was fortunate enough to go to a Julius Rosenwald school. He had been brought south by Booker T. Washington and looked at the appalling state of educational facilities for colored children living in the South. He devised a plan. He did not give the money to communities. He gave 1/3 of the cost of building a school. He gave the plans. The community was required to raise 1/3, and the powers that be that were traditionally building these dilapidated schools gave 1/3. So the community had a direct involvement with it. It was not a gift. And therefore, I went to a school where everybody in my community was involved. We felt that it was an important place to go. Now, by the time, I didn't go to school in the 20s, so by the time I went to school in the late 50s and 60s, I went to Lincoln High School from grade 7 through 12. Well, this school, which was so different that people say to me, you went to a private school? And I said, no, it was a public school. My school had the only library that we were allowed to use in town. And Sumter is not a small town. They had a large library. But if you were colored, you could not use the library. We had a band room. We had a language laboratory. I parlay a little Francais because I took language courses via television in the language laboratory. We had a chemistry lab. We had a gymnasium. We had science rooms. It was a fully laid out school that gave me the basis that allowed me to finally leave high school and go to college with a strong enough background that I was able to do well. Part of the thing of living in the segregated South is we live within these communities within a community. I was never hungry. I was never made to feel that I was an outcast because my Aunt Susie always stood in when we needed things. When I was a child, I always used to say that my friends just pray to God, I pray to God and write to Aunt Susie. I'm guaranteed to get what I want. So I lived these years in the South thinking that I was hated by everybody white in my hometown. One of the things that I can say that publishing primary lessons, which is not an indictment of racism, it is simply the story of a family's survival within the framework of Jim Crow laws. As we look back at these things, I sometimes wonder how I managed to not be psychologically beaten down by it. But again, because my aunt told me that I was as good as anybody, that I could do anything I wanted as long as I was willing to work, she said to me, you're going to college so you don't have to do laundry like I do. And I always remembered that. And one of the other saving graces for me was the written word. I love to read, and I read books about people in all these other places, but anyone here remember Weekly Reader? The Weekly Reader paired me as a pen pal with a young girl my age in South Dakota. We wrote letters back and forth for 5 years. And in those letters, she hated South Dakota the same way I hated South Carolina. So I began to realize that the things that I was feeling were not things that were alien to the rest of the world. It just happened to be where I was. So my goal was, I'm going to live up north where everybody's free and you can run your own life and do what you want to do. It was just a matter of getting through those first. I figured if I got out of high school and got to college, my life would change. And I was fortunate that I went to school when I was 5 years old. In the South, you have to be 6 before you can register for school, and my birthday is in February, and I wasn't 6 before the end of the year. So when I lived with my mother, we lived around the corner from a Catholic church. And I used to watch the kids in the schoolyard. So one day I went over and lied to the nuns. I told them I was 6 years old, that my mother couldn't find my birth certificate, and would they please let me go to school, and I'd bring the birth certificate as soon as she could find it. I'm sure they knew I was not 6 years old. However, they admitted me, and at the end of the year, passed me through to 2nd grade. So for the first 3 years of my life, I went to Catholic school. Now, mind you, I am a Methodist Episcopal, and my mother did not like the fact that the nuns were running my life, and in turn, I was trying to dictate how she was supposed to live our life. No, we can't eat meat on Friday. Sister so-and-so says we can't do that. I have to leave room on my right for my guardian angel, and all these things. So my mother was like, I don't know where I got you from. would go to Catholic church Mass in the morning before I'd come home and go to church with my family. We hit a sticking point when my mother said to me, "No, you cannot be confirmed. You were christened a Methodist Episcopal, and that's what you are." So she took me out of Catholic school and sent me to public school by this time. So because I'd been promoted, they accepted me even though I was a year younger. I had no way of knowing that that early lie would affect the rest of my life. When I was just turning 17, when this picture of me at my debutante cotillion was taken, my mother had been sick with asthma for quite a while, and as the last of the two children home, I was her caretaker. My mother died 2 weeks after this picture was taken, 3 months before I was to graduate from high school. So realize I've got an absentee father. My mother dies, but I'm only 3 months away from high school graduation. What if I had not lied and been in 11th grade? Because I was only 3 months away from graduation, I stayed with friends in Sumter until graduation and then went off to college. Had I not been that close to graduation, my older sisters, who by now lived and worked in Washington, D.C., would have taken me to Washington, D.C. Can you imagine having to spend the last year of your high school education in a strange city where you know no one? I was fortunate to be able to stay there, and my teachers who knew my mother took a special interest and encouraged me. I've always been talkative. My mother said to me when I was a child, "Oh, you love to talk." Well, let me give you a word of advice. If you're going to talk so much, you must involve yourself in things that matter so that people will want to listen to you talk. Otherwise, you will be a pain in everybody's you-know-what. So that's one piece of advice that I accepted without question. I was editor of my high school newspaper. I had a weekly radio show where I wrote and delivered the school news. I was the local MC for every program that the high school had. And this prepared me. That, and in my church, we were taught to do public speaking. And it became a part of what happens. People say, you know, public speaking and taxes, you know, next to fear of death, those are the greatest things. And I'm like, what are you afraid of? It's been ingrained in me. So it was one of the primary lessons. The reason this book is called Primary Lessons is because so many of the things that sustained me after my mother's death were things that she had taught me against my will when I was young and growing up. One of the things that I learned, though, is that the primary lessons we learn must often be unlearned. This book has taught me that all the white people who lived in my hometown didn't hate me. A lot of it was a lack of communication. In my hometown, my only interactions with whites were in business, at the bank, in the grocery store, where a local grocer named Touchberry allowed my mother to have a line of credit so that when she got paid once a month, which is how teachers were paid, she could pay him and we could continue to eat during the month. That's why I say I was never hungry. So here again, I'm learning. She's taught me I could not trust white people, and yet I have an example of one who proved to be more than trustworthy. So there are other lessons, and I think that I need to segue a bit into how this book fits into the framework of what we're living now. So much of what's happening is we don't communicate with people. If you don't know what people are thinking and how they're living and how much like your life theirs is, you think they're different. It is amazing to me when I have someone come up to me and say, "Your life is my life," and they're white. They're foreign. I had an Italian woman crying in the back of the audience saying, My father came to America and left us in Italy. He came back periodically to visit, and every time he came back, my mother had another baby, and like you, I longed for my father's return. I wanted him to come back and be a part of our lives. I get people who say, like you, I was reared by an aunt or an uncle and didn't want to go home. Like you, I went to college as an orphan. Like you, I went through school on the National Defense Student Loan, which is how I went to college and paid for it. Like you, I said I was never going to get married or have children. And I can say to you that I was 44 years old before I broke down and got married. I used to tell my mother she was crazy to stay married to a man who didn't stay home and take care of her. And she said to me, "You'll understand when you're grown." My mother nor my father ever remarried. When my father died, when my mother died, we didn't know where my father was to tell him that his wife had died. 8 months later, he died, and we got a phone call from Florida saying it. So we buried both of them side by side, and we said they could not be together in life, but they were together in death. So this has been an interesting journey for me, and this is simply book one. I am at work on book two. The problem in my life is I'm too busy living book three to write book two. I tell people I get up in the morning and get dressed. I never know what the circumstances of the day are going to be. I have people call me. I have things come up. As Director of Arts and Culture, I interact with a lot of people in Greenberg, but I am constantly marketing because the editor for my book said to me, "You don't need to worry about trying to fly out the gate to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Your book has legs. It is written in the voice of a 5-year-old, and it moves along as I move along. I take you through my introduction into the South. I take you through my introduction into my family, and I take you into the point where my mother explains to me why she never migrated north, how she loved her life in the South, and how she loved the South even though it didn't love her back. It was something that I didn't learn until I was in my 40s and went back south and began to experience what she lived. I had stayed away for 20 years. You know what it is to leave your home and never want to go back? I have since learned to love this place, which is responsible for making me who I am. I'm always surprised at the number of people in Westchester County from South Carolina. I'm surprised there's no one in the audience who will raise a hand and tell me some tie that they have. I claim that South Carolina is a wonderful place to be from. I'd like to ask if you have questions or things you want to have me talk more about. I can't believe there. No, oh, yes. Hold on a second. They're going to bring you the mic.
Thank you for telling us this inspiring story. Where did you go to college?
I did my undergraduate work at Morgan State University in Baltimore. I went to grad school at the University of Maryland, College Park.
I see. Thank you again.
I didn't put it here because it's limited.
And somebody said, that's a very interesting speaker. Why don't you stay? And I am so glad I stayed because I thoroughly enjoyed hearing you speak and your life stories. Because I had a very, not similar story, but I also had problems in my life going back to my childhood. And it's wonderful to overcome these and go on with your life, which you did. And I really appreciated hearing you speak.
Thank you. See, I told you, we have these similarities that we don't even know exist.
I'm very interested, going back to the time when you were 5 years old or less and enrolled yourself in Catholic school. Can you recall what your mindset was, that you made up your mind that said, I have to take this education into my own hands. My parents are not going to be able to help me do this?
My mother had sent me to an Episcopal daycare, and they were playing school. My aunt had told me that I'd learned to write and I could write her a letter. The reason I had to go to school was I needed to learn how to write so I could write her a letter and tell her it was not like she told me it would be. She said, your sisters will like playing with you. My sisters didn't like playing with me. I was a snot-nosed little kid who thought I was better than they were. And in addition, I was just sure that if I could write to my Aunt Susie and tell her how bad it was, she would come and get me. And that was the motivation for getting in school. People like to ask me how I remember all these things. It was so traumatic, it was ingrained.
Did you suffer from Jim Crow?
I can tell you that yes, everybody who lives in the South who's of color suffered under Jim Crow. One of the incidents that I specifically remember that was very traumatic for me, in department stores, if I use the word colored because that's what we were during that period, so it changes in the book. Coloreds were required to wait until all whites in the store were served before you could be waited on. And my mother and I had waited patiently. Mind you, my mother's a respected school teacher in my community. We're waiting to be served, and the clerk comes to us. And just as she approaches us, a white woman comes in the store and she turns away, and I say, no, no, wait, we're next. So the whole store kind of stops, and my mother turns around and slaps me. And a white woman says, that's right, teach that girl to stay in her place.
Because I have something very similar to when I was stationed in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, during the Korean War, where there were colored fountains and white fountains, etc., etc. The incident I remember distinctly to this day is we were in town having dinner in uniform, and we witnessed a fender bender. White man, young colored boy. The white man hit the colored boy's car. When the police arrived, we said, we witnessed it, it was the white man's fault. He said, go back to the Pine Bluff Arsenal, get out of here, it's none of your business. And I'll never forget it. There was nothing that we could do.
I was on a panel in Chicago for Aging in America, and one of my fellow panelists was a black lawyer from Florida who had been a district attorney and something else. And one of the things that they did is they asked us about a pivotal story that affected your life. He talked about the time that his father was driving them to the beach one summer, and they were driving from Jacksonville, where they lived, out to the beach, but they had to go through a couple of small towns to get to the beach. And he said that you couldn't pass a white person ahead of you in traffic. They set the pace. You couldn't drive around them and drive ahead. And he said his father was being very careful, and his father did something that the local sheriff in the town stopped them. And this was heartbreaking to listen to all these years later. He said, the sheriff, he rolled down the window, and the sheriff said something to him, and he said, officer, what did I do? And the officer said something back. And his wife said, but officer, we weren't doing anything. And the officer said to his father, tell that bitch to shut up. And the father turned to his wife and said, honey, I'll take care of it. And the sheriff said, that's not what I told you to tell her. His father had to turn around and say, bitch, shut up. And mind you, in front of his children, how must that man have felt to have to do this? His son said, that was not a good day at the beach. These are stories that we all know you can't drink out of the white fountain, you can't use the white, but that kind of psychological terror is just a terrible thing for a young boy to have to see, and he's supposed to absorb it and continue in the vein of how the Southern way of living was set in motion.
Just wondering whether during your lifetime, what experiences you had or contacts with the Martin Luther Jr. Period, and you might comment on some of that.
In summer of 1963, I had just graduated from college, and I went to Vermont and worked as a cook's assistant at a rich girls' camp. My Aunt Susie had gotten me this job, and she said it was a real step up. I wanted to be home marching, but you must understand that your children are a conglomerate of who you are. I have two people at war inside me. My mother's belief is you protect your own and your family. My father is you protect the group, the whole. So there's this battle going on with me. My mother did not want integration. My mother felt that integrating the schools was going to be detrimental for black children because children do what teachers expect them to do. And if you're in a setting where nobody expects you to do anything and nobody's going to encourage you, you will never prosper. So my mother was against it. My father was in favor of it. So it's this struggle going on inside me about the civil rights movement. I want to go and march, and I know I am 17 years old. I've got a national defense student loan, and I've got 4 years to get out of college. I don't have time to think about the movement. But after working that summer and coming home, my sister, who was married with a 2-year-old baby, went to the March on Washington. Her husband wouldn't let her take the baby because he said this is going to break out in disaster, because when you come from the South, every one of these marches becomes the Birmingham, the fire. He knew all kind of things were going to happen. They didn't come true, but this was his feeling. So I stayed home and kept the baby. So I watched the I Have a Dream speech on television, just like so many other hundreds of thousands across America. I have not been, but I have to tell you that the impact of what he said stuck with me in ways I could never begin to think. My husband is white. The last thing I would have ever expected was that I would have been able to change the principle. I told my husband when he started dating me that I couldn't possibly marry a white man. Didn't you understand what I've been through, what my family has been through, the price it's paid? I can't do this. And he told me he would just stick around until I stopped looking at the color of his skin and looked at the color of his heart. So again, Martin Luther King wanted his children to be judged by the content of their character. If I'm expecting that from other people, don't I have the obligation to give them that same kind of respect? So that's how the movement with Martin Luther King has affected me. It hasn't altered so many things about my life because I see so many problems that have not changed in all this time. But the sense of hopefulness, I've been gifted with a sense of optimism about being alive. And that sense of optimism allows me to experience things and not let them destroy who I am, which is why I said the power of the individual amidst adversity. We decide what we're going to do with our lives. Life is difficult for everyone. It is never exactly how you want it to be. I discovered working in Vermont the summer of 1963 that there were girls there who were going on the bus rides to the South, white girls who, according to camp protocol, I couldn't talk to because I was the help. In Vermont, segregation had to do with economic status. I was the help. We couldn't talk to these girls, and yet these girls were like me, honor society members. I got to hear them. You overhear them talking about their lives, the imperfection of their lives. I figured if you were white with two parents, you had it made in the world. I discovered that was not the case. Everyone has their own set of problems they're dealing with, and it's up to the individual to decide, how am I going to live? What am I going to do with my life? What difference will I make? Someone said to me, you've got the survivor syndrome, and I said, it's true. I am the child of the dream that Martin Luther King had. I am the child of my parents. Just an aside, I am not the first generation college educated in my family. My mother and my father were both college educated. My grandmother and my grandfather went to college and were school teachers. My great-grandfather, their father, was an ex-slave who could not read or write, who owned 1,200 acres of land in the late 1800s in South Carolina. That's what I come from. Those are the shoulders on which I stand. Those are the things that make me unafraid. There is nothing the world can do to me that will harm me in the way that they had to live and were harmed.
Every time I start thinking that things have changed, I open the newspaper, and my thoughts are shattered. What's the next step?
You're asking me. I call it one at a time. That's how I see it, because I'm from the South, where when things get too overwhelming, a woman takes to her bed. And there have been so many times in the last year I wanted to take to my bed because I think nothing can happen. And then some small thing shows me that what we're seeing is not the majority. It is just that those of us who think things are simply going to change on their own must recognize it doesn't. The best thing that I ever saw happen was probably 10 or 15 years ago. A church in the Midwest required their parishioners to adopt a family in the community. They could not give the family money. They were required to interact with that family and teach them what they knew. And this was a mixed community. And at the end of this trial period, the people from the church talked about how they took them to grocery stores outside of their poor community where they could buy things much less expensively, how they were teaching them about financial management, how they were doing all these things that people who've had privilege know instinctively. They were teaching them how to file their income taxes and what things to claim and not to claim, how to protect yourself, so many basic things you know that somebody else doesn't know. And in this community, they talked about how the families were impacted, but the people who did it talked about how empowering it was to make them feel they could make a difference in the world. It is when we think we can't make a difference that we settle down and don't do anything. And I think that so many of us have taken for granted that, well, that's illogical, it won't happen. No, illogical things are happening because we're letting them happen. And I think that we each need to take a sense of responsibility in the small framework of our lives so that the ripple effect begins to work. If it's only one-on-one, you must teach someone. Teach them to be better by example and by encouragement. But it's a bigger problem than the one-on-one, and I often say I'm not sure I'm the person to make it, but it's depressing at times, but I refuse to let circumstances depress me.
I'm sitting and listening to your story. I was 15 years old when I moved from New York City to North Carolina. My father had a factory in Allentown, Pennsylvania, decided he wanted to go south. So he looked for a building, and we found this building in a little town of 15,000 people. I lived there for 20 years. And you're telling me a story that I could tell you things from the other side that are so terrible, nobody would believe it. But when we came there, there was one building that my father liked, and they bought the building. The town practically gave it to him to open a factory to employ people. This is 1933.
Okay.
And we opened this factory, and when we got there were 2 bathrooms. And he realized, they told him that they have a black bathroom. I call it black because they resented the name colored, because there are all kind of colors. I'm a colored, you're a colored. So they had 2 bathrooms, and for the blacks and for the whites. And after a while, my father couldn't stand it. So he's a very smart man, and he ripped down the bathrooms and put up individual bathrooms all along the walls. And anyone who wanted to go to a bathroom would go into the bathroom. So when a black person went in, there was a black person. A white person went in, there was a white person. The city council came to him and said, Mr. Fuchs, you can't do that. You've got to have separate bathrooms. My father said, I have separate bathrooms. There's only one person in the bathroom at a time. That's why when I want to tell you these stories that I lived through for 20 years, when they had desegregation, by that time I was in a factory, running a factory, and we had supervisors who were very intelligent white girls. I came in one morning, and she was crying. And she was a very intelligent person, supposedly. And I said to her, Verna, why are you crying? She said, did you read what's happening? So I said, yes, I think it's wonderful. She says, Mr. Fuchs, you don't understand. You weren't born here. I was. She says, we're going to have rapes. We're going to have this and that. Like the world was coming. I said, that's not going to happen. You wait and see. And later on, she came to me and said, you know, Mr. Fuchs, I think maybe you're right, that everything seems to be running smoothly. But some of the things that happened, that they blamed the whites, they shouldn't have. Because when this happened, they opened up a private school, and people took out their children and sent them to a private school, and everyone up north was saying these people were so prejudiced. And what was happening was the people who had children in school, I had children in school, and they felt they weren't going to give their children a proper education. So what was happening was when they desegregated the schools, they put half in one school, half in the other.
They did that in my hometown.
The teachers who came over to the white schools were inferior because they wouldn't let them go to the proper colleges. So they felt that they're not getting the right education. I didn't do that because we were moving back up north. But I went through, when I first got there, I was walking down the street downtown, and a black person was coming toward us. He stepped into the street, and I couldn't believe it, but this is what I saw. Well, anyway, in the factory, we kept doing things where it was contrary to the city council, and they kept bothering my father. He said, look, we're employing 1,000 people here. I am telling you now, you walk into that front door again and bother me about this problem you think you have. He says, I'm packing up and getting out of here. So that we never saw them again.
Your father did what I say must be done. Each person in the circumstances that they are must not accept immorality and things that are wrong. He did exactly what would make change. And I think that all the people who worked for him began to see him as a role model of how it was. And when he told that girl that what you're thinking is not going to come true, someone needed to say it, because what happens is in the South, they have this party line that's pulled out and issued every time anything comes up. The whole idea of the Confederate statues, that they're remembering their history and they never want to forget, and yet they tell blacks who grew up like this young man whose father had to humiliate his mother and say, you should forget and get over it. It's a two-party. I call it the double-edged sword. You want to do this, but you don't want to do that. Thank you for your story, and I often say the reason that I write is because people don't know these stories, and therefore they function in a vacuum and think that some original thought is original, and it's not. Here you are from the other side telling this story. We need far more communication.
I want to tell you one last story, and that's it. We would make a Christmas party every year. And we had blacks and we had whites. So when he made the first party, they came from the city council and said, you've got to have everything separate. So my father took a bunch of cardboard cases and lined them up, and he had the blacks on one side and the white on the other side. And they came up, and they said, that's the way it should be. So he said, okay. But we hired one band. It was a black band. My father made sure about that. So after a while, they were dancing and having a good time, and we had liquor, and they had liquor. By 10 o'clock or 10:30, the cartons had been dissipated. And what they did was, with the music, the blacks and the whites were dancing together. And that was one of the incidents my father resented. And then we went and we had taken the intelligent black people and made them supervisors. Can't do that, because they had white girls and black girls working under that section. Mm-hmm. So that's when he threatened them to leave. That's the end of my...
Well, let me thank you on behalf of all those people who worked for your father, because that was all that people in the South of color were asking for, a fair shake. They weren't asking for anything extra. They simply wanted to come to work, earn money, take care of their families, send their children to school. So I personally thank you for what your father did.
Ms. White, thank you very much for that most interesting presentation. I understand you have copies of your book.
I shamelessly self-promote. While it was a privilege to come and talk to you, it took a lot of work to put this together. My publisher spent a lot of time, a lot of effort. I encourage you to buy copies of the book, to read, to give. It always surprised me. I figured that women would buy the book. Then I discovered their husbands were coming to me saying, I read that book and we've given it to our children. It is an easily read, but it has a lot of depth about a family in the South and all the things that a mother's willing to do to keep her family fed and cared for. I hear it's an interesting story and a good read. I've gotten 52 5-star reviews on Amazon. And books are available for $20. If you want to pay cash, I take cash. If you want to write a check, yes, but I don't take credit cards.
And in appreciation of your presentation, we have the highly coveted old guard clock, which you can use to keep time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.